This is Daniel Simon at Baton Rouge Community College. This is, of course, week 5 of my history podcast lectures for History 1123. Of course, at the end of this week, of course, we will be finishing up the end of World War II. Now, we'll talk about the major events of the Cold War. I plan to hopefully have this as my last lecture for the semester for us. So anyway, from last time we had covered up to 1941 in World War II. I believe we had discussed how the United States got in World War II because of the fact that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor December 1941. We also need to talk about like 1942. 42, you know, was the turning point year of World War II. There were a series of battles that were important that happened in World War II in that year. In the North African campaign, which was from 41 to 43, where the Axis powers fought the Allies, mostly in North Africa, the Battle of El Alamein was real important. And the Battle of El Alamein was a strategic battle in northern Egypt because if you know what happened, Hitler backed Mussolini in Libya, and he sent a German general there, which was Erwin Rommel, who's, of course, you know, later known as the Desert Fox. It's his nickname. And Rommel formed a Italian, German military corps in North Africa called the Africa Corps. It was mostly a tank, mobile type army, which he used to fight in Libya and Egypt, also later in Algeria and Tunisia. And anyway, he would take on the British 8th Army in northern Egypt, a general named Bernard Montgomery, who's sometimes called Monty as a nickname. And that was a very strategic battle. The Second Battle of El Alamein, as they called it, was fought between October 23rd to November 11th, 1942. And in that battle, Rommel's forces was badly routed by the British 8th Army under Bernard Montgomery, and it caused his forces to basically be pushed back into Libya, and they even pushed them back into, I think, Algeria at that point. So the North African campaign for, you know, the Nazis didn't go very well. And then also another thing that happened, of course, in the West, you had the Operation Torch that happened. Operation Torch was where the U.S. forces under the command of Dwight D. Eisenhower landed in French territories in North Africa. They freed that area of Morocco and Algeria at that point. And so the U.S. allies with the British eventually sandwiched Rommel's forces in what is Tunisia. And eventually his forces were forced to surrender in 1943. And so the North African campaign was kind of a blow for Hitler. That's one of his big defeats he has, of course, against the Allies in the West. The other big turning point in 1942, of course, they say the big turning point battle, was the Battle of Stalingrad, which happened between August 23rd, 1942 to February 2nd, 1943. Stalingrad was a strategic battle on the Eastern Front. If you know much about Stalingrad, it was a city which was on the Volga River. It's kind of in western, really southwestern Russia would be where it is. And it's a turning point battle because it was considered to be really Hitler's worst defeat on the Eastern Front that he'll suffer up to that point. And it ends up, of course, being a defeat which forces the Germans back on the defensive, and eventually the Soviets began pushing the Germans back, starting in 1943, back towards Germany. So I believe that Stalingrad was a very important battle, and of course it is considered one of the bloodiest battles in human history. I think close to 2 million casualties was how many killed and wounded on both sides, and there was even a case where the German 6th Army was actually captured by the Soviet side. So Stalingrad is a very strategic battle. A lot of people think that that battle is one of the key battles and why the Germans lost on the Eastern Front. And from there, the Germans are just going to start reeling and eventually losing territory. Operation Husky, what was that? That was an Allied operation where the Allies invaded what is Sicily in Italy. It kind of started what they call the Italian campaign. It was in July of 1943 when it happened. British and mostly the U.S. Led forces took the island of Sicily, and from there, what happened was Mussolini, who was still Prime Minister Italy, he was so embarrassed by this that he was forced to resign. And so what happened was Italy decided that they didn't want to be on the Axis side anymore, and so they switched to the Allied side in the war. You know about that. And so the Germans decided to fight on by themselves. And so Germany and Italy fought the Allied powers, what became known as the Italian campaign, as they dub it, which will last from 1943 to 45. And it'll take the Allies almost 2 years to take Italy. Italy was actually a pretty bloody conflict because of the fact that Italy was so mountainous. And the Germans were led by this general named Albert Kesselring. Kesselring used like fortifications in the mountains and hills of Italy to set up defensive positions. And so the Allies had to slowly push back the Germans, and they did take Rome back. I think Rome was the first Axis capital that fell in June of 1944, and so, but it would take them almost another year to get up into like northern Italy, eventually. Then in France, you had the D-Day invasion. As you know, the Allies then invaded, occupied France in June of 1944. It was called the so-called D-Day invasion, which started on June 6, 1944. The D-Day forces were led by Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was considered like the supreme head of the Allied Expeditionary Force that eventually invades France. And it included, by the way, U.S. forces with the British, Canadians, and other allies like the Free French were involved. The United States put up probably about 60% of the forces, most likely. And the initial invasion was called Operation Overlord. That was the secret code name for the actual invasion of France, which, if you know about it, took place in Normandy, which is in the northern part of France. And the D-Day invasion was the largest amphibious invasion in world history. There was a thing called Operation Bodyguard. I don't know if you know much about what that was, but Operation Bodyguard was this secret Allied plan to fool the Nazis on where the invasion location of D-Day would be. And so they created like fake invasion armies, like in England, to make it like they were going to attack where the Calais is, which is northern France, instead of like where Normandy is. And so like the Americans had like this army that was called the First U.S. Army Group, and it was a fake army, basically. It wasn't real, but it pretended like it was going to try to attack Calais in northern France instead of Normandy, to try to fool the Germans. And yeah, the Germans were caught off guard by that. They allowed the Americans, British, and other allies to get a foothold in what would be Normandy later. There were different Allied landing beaches on D-Day. They were famous June 6, 1944. The U.S. forces landed on Omaha and Utah beaches, and the British, Canadians, some of their other forces, would land on what is Gold, Sword, and Juno beaches. And from there, they would push inward in the Normandy. And that would lead to what they call the Battle of Normandy, which was fought between July and August of 1944. Battle of Normandy was a strategic battle because it was important in trying to take back Paris, which was one of their main goals, the Allies. And the most strategic, decisive battle of it was called the Battle of the Fillies Pocket, or Gap, sometimes it's called, which took place between August 12th to the 21st, 1944. That's when the Allied forces west of Paris encircled some of Hitler's German forces in like a pocket, they called it. They almost wiped it out, but there was a gap that was, I think, still left, and some of them were able to escape. but this battle was very strategic because Paris fell basically 3 days later, on August 24th, 1944. So Paris falls, and with that, the Germans are going to start backing up towards Belgium at that point. Because most of the Germans are fighting in the east against the Soviets. Before that happened, they had the 20 July plot that happened. And this was kind of a secretive plot by some members of the German Wehrmacht, German army, to try to kill Hitler, to try to assassinate him. Some called it Operation Valkyrie, and there was a ring of officers that wanted to kill Hitler off, and then maybe take control of the war. And there was a German officer by the name of Klaus von Stauffenberg. He actually went to Hitler's headquarters in a place called Rastenburg, which is, I think, in East Prussia, sometimes called the Wolf's Lair. And he had a bomb in a briefcase. He tried to kill Hitler with a bomb, but it failed. And a lot of the conspirators were actually caught and they were executed. So the whole plot failed. Then at the end of the year, at this point, the Germans are being driven back into Belgium and Germany. And so Hitler decided in December of 1945 to counterattack the Allies, mostly the British and the French. And so that led to what they call the Battle of the Bulge, which happened between December 1944 to January 1945. The Battle of the Bulge was the last offensive battle that was done by the Germans in World War II. Sometimes called the offensive or counteroffensive in the Ardennes. There's another name they dub it as well. And it was really the bloodiest battle that the United States fought in World War II. We suffered something like 75,000 casualties and I want to say 19 or 20,000 dead in that battle. And what happened was that German forces surprised the Allies in what is the Ardennes forests, like in 1940. And they almost broke through in Belgium. They formed a huge bulge in the Allied lines. And the battle went on for like 5-6 weeks, the Battle of the Bulge. But eventually the Germans ran out of supplies and fuel, and the actual offensive, basically, it just declined, and they weren't able to. Their objective was actually to reach the coast and try to split the Allies in half, but it totally failed. After that, the Allies from the east and west then drove into Germany, starting pretty much in the spring of 1940. Berlin fell eventually by early May, April-May 1945. The Soviets fought the last battle, which was called the Battle of Berlin, and Berlin fell after that. And on May 8th, 1945, the Germans began surrendering to the Allies, which was often called Victory in Europe Day or VE Day, and pretty much the war in Europe will be over. After the war, Germany will be divided up, which I'll talk about later. And that's one of the main issues that leads to the Cold War after World War II. Also, they had what they call the Pacific War, usually a Pacific campaign, that was fought between the United States versus Japan. This was mostly fought in the Pacific, and it was also fought in Asia, like in China, etc. For us, the United States, it mostly lasts from 1941 to 45, but it did go back to the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War between China and Japan. Pacific War was started, they believe, for the United States with the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. The U.S. eventually would try to counterattack, the Japanese. One of the critical battles we know about it was in June of 1942. The Battle of Midway was the big turning point in the war against Japan in the Pacific. And Midway was one of like 5 major carrier battles in World War II that were pretty important. What happened was near what is Midway Atoll, which is halfway in the Pacific, the Japanese were hoping to take Midway and then launch attacks on Hawaii and basically take it. And eventually what happened was June 4th to 7th, the U.S. Navy fought the Japanese Navy in a carrier battle. And what occurred was the U.S. Navy's aircraft was able to strike the Japanese Navy. They sunk 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, which was a big blow. The Japanese, they say the Japanese never really recovered from that. And so afterwards, pretty much the Japanese pretty much would start losing after that. From then on, the strategy of the United States in the Pacific War was they came up with a strategy called island hopping or leapfrogging, I think they called it, where they would basically hop from island to island and basically take all the strategic islands back in the Pacific. And there were 2 routes they took. Some was like through the southern Pacific. The U.S. Army took various islands back under mostly the command of General Douglas MacArthur. And then the U.S. Navy with the Marines would attack through the central Pacific. And they were under the command of Admiral Chester Nimitz, head of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. And or various islands they took back. The Solomon Islands chain was really the first set of islands they took back in 1943. That was involved in a pivotal battle that took like 5-6 months, like the Battle of Guadalcanal, which you may have heard of. That was a famous U.S. Marine battle they fought in. Then in 43, also the Marshall Islands fell, such as Tarawa. Tarawa was like in the central Pacific. And those fell in about November 1943. The Marianas Islands really were the most strategic islands that they had that fell, such as Saipan, Tinian, Guam. Those were important because the U.S. could then use them as air bases to attack Japan, which we would from the air. So we'd start bombing Japan in 1944-45 to help in the war. Also, the Philippines, which had been taken by the Japanese, was also taken back between 1944 to 45. So that took a while as well. And then in 1945, there were really the 2 most famous battles that were fought in the Pacific. Was Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Iwo Jima was a volcanic island which was kind of south of Japan, like right here in the Pacific. And the U.S. wanted to take control of Iwo Jima because they could use it as like a base for bombers to land maybe halfway between Japan and was the Marianas Islands. And so it was March of 1945. U.S. Marines stormed, the beaches of Iwo Jima and seized control of it. And there's a picture back here, which is very, very famous with Iwo Jima, which is the so-called flag waving. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi, which is a dormant volcano, which is on one end of the island. During the battle, 6 famous Marines raised the American flag on Iwo Jima. That's considered one of the most iconic, pictures ever taken in World War II, at least on the American perspective in the war. So they took Iwo Jima, and then after that, what happened? Then the Americans then took Okinawa. Okinawa was one of the home islands that was south of Japan too, and the Japanese put up a fight there, if you know about it, and Okinawa lasted from April to June of 1945. Sometimes called Operation Iceberg, and it took them like 3 months to take Okinawa almost, and a lot of the Japanese fought to the death, and I forget how many were killed, but we killed over 100-something thousand of them died in the battle. From there, we were then going to invade Japan, but the U.S. developed the Manhattan Project. If you know about that, the Manhattan Project was the U.S. project to develop a nuclear weapon, which was going to be used on Germany, but they eventually used it on Japan instead. It's a very secret project, which cost about $12 million. And the project was around from about 1942 to the end of the war. And it was run by several men. The most important was a general named Leslie Groves. Leslie Groves was a U.S. Army general. He was known for being the guy that ran the project to build the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C., which is the main defense building. And he hired a bunch of scientists to work on the project. The project itself was centered eventually at headquarters in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where they eventually, built the bombs. And the guy that ran it was a guy named J. Robert Oppenheimer. He was a famous American physicist, and he pretty much helped design the bombs. And later, Oppenheimer, was known as the father of the atomic bomb. They had the Trinity test, which was done on July 16, 1945 in New Mexico. That was where they exploded the first atomic bomb, if you know about that. And the first bomb built was called the Gadget. They kind of gave it a nickname. And they didn't know what it was going to do. And when it blew up, it created a huge mushroom cloud, which they realized they now had this secret weapon that they could use. And I think Oppenheimer claimed that it was a new kind of weapon that could possibly, destroy the world. So they would eventually drop two bombs on Japan, atomic bombs. The two bombs, were Little Boy and Fat Man. Little Boy, you see the skinnier one. That bomb was eventually dropped on what is Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. There was a famous bomber that dropped it. You may have heard of it, called the B-29 Superfortress, which was called the Enola Gay. It's the most famous, probably, plane in World War II. It actually dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, which may have killed close to 100,000 people. And then the other bomb you can see, which is Nagasaki, the fatter one, the Fat Man. It was dropped on Nagasaki on August the 9th, 1945. And that one killed not quite as many, but I think both combined killed almost 200,000, possibly. And so Japan, after that, basically decided to surrender less than a week later. And on August 15, 1945, the Japanese surrendered, so-called VJ Day, or Victory in Japan, over Japan Day. And then September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese eventually officially surrendered in what is Tokyo Bay on the USS Missouri. So that's usually considered the end date in World War II. Of course, there are a lot of casualties in World War II. Something like 50, 60 million people died in World War II. They believe close to 2/3 of the Jewish population in Europe may have been murdered by the Nazis, which may have been close to 6 million. And it was later called the Holocaust, or Shoah. And the Holocaust was a Nazi genocide plan to exterminate all European Jews. And it was done pretty much from France all the way to Russia. And during the war, the Germans rounded up Jews and they put them in concentration camps. And those that they didn't want or wanted to get rid of, they basically exterminated them in death camps, which most of the death camps were built in what is Poland. And one of the, there's like a bunch of, there's like close to like maybe 10 of them that were famous at one point. But the most notorious was Auschwitz, in Poland. And it had the most deaths. The Germans, came up with the idea to use gas chambers to gas, Jews and other people before they burned their bodies. And I think at Auschwitz over 1 million people died, as far as they know. But other famous death camps you may have heard of were Treblinka, Sobibor, was pretty famous, Matadek, Chelmno, Belzec. Those are all examples of different, camps they had. And they also had, like, Germany, they had camps like Dachau, you may have heard of in Germany, which was well known as well. A lot of this was found out after the war, as you know. Then they had a bunch of war crimes trials against Nazis, which was later called the Nuremberg Trials. This occurred between 1945 and 46, and there was a series of trials that took place in Nuremberg, Germany, where various Nazis were put on trial for war crimes against various people and Jews. And several famous Nazis were put on trial. I guess the most famous I'll give you is Hermann Goering. He was the most famous Nazi that they arrested and eventually found guilty. And other ones weren't there. Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, they all killed themselves by the end of the war. And so they weren't there. But the Nuremberg trials, they ended up like hanging a lot of people like for that, basically. Let's move on to talk about the Cold War. The Cold War, of course, era came next after World War II. It's kind of a post-war period, which goes from the 1940s to like 1991. What was the Cold War? The Cold War was a geopolitical, ideological struggle that was between the Soviet Union and their allies, which was sometimes called the Eastern Bloc, versus the United States and their allies, which was called the Western Bloc. And the Cold War was believed to have started right after World War II. They think Germany, which I'll talk about a little later, was one of the causes of it that occurred. And then in Asia, you had other problems too, where communism spread there as well. So it was like almost like communist East versus the democratic capitalist West. And it almost led to World War III, if you know about it, because both sides had nuclear weapons. The United Nations was formed after World War II. They think that helped to kind of start the Cold War as well. And the United Nations was an intergovernmental peacekeeping organization that was formed in 1945 by the Allies after the war. It was mostly created to prevent like wars from breaking out like World War II, and eventually it was headquartered in New York City, where the main UN building is now. And it was formed originally by the Big Five. The Big Five were the five winning allies of the war afterwards, which were the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. And they formed the so-called Security Council, which was the main organ that runs it. And it has, the Big Five are permanent members on it, if you know that. And then they usually allow 10 other non-permanent members for like usually 2-year terms. And the Big Five would often have veto. They could veto like resolutions. And that's part of what caused the Cold War, in a sense, was because you'd have the U.S., Britain, and France versus Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. So that created a lot of tensions between East and West, and they would often veto stuff each other. If some resolution would come up. Of course, the big thing that caused the Cold War was Germany was divided up, of course, into 4 parts. You can see here the Soviet Union took over that red area, which eventually became known as East Germany. And then the areas you see in green, blue, and orange were basically controlled by Britain, France, and the United States. And that became what they call West Germany. And so you got a case where Germany is divided in half by the 1940s. And that was a major cause of why why the Cold War happened and all that. And what's crazy is they even took Berlin, and they divided Berlin, which was in East Germany. Berlin was divided into 4 parts, and East Berlin was controlled by the Soviet Union, and West Berlin was controlled by Britain, France, and the United States. So that was really something that was there when they divided that up as well. So that's a division of Germany was a big cause of the Cold War. The term Iron Curtain, that was a term that was coined by Winston Churchill in 1946. If you know about Eastern Europe after the end of World War II was taken over by the Soviet Union, and they basically converted the whole thing to communism. So Czechoslovakia, Romania, Albania, Bulgaria, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, all that became basically communist overnight. Yugoslavia did too as well. And so all that was communist in East Germany. And that's what Churchill meant by the Iron Curtain. Iron Curtain coming down, and everything behind the curtain, was pretty much communist as a whole. The president at the time, Harry S. Truman, who had taken over after FDR died, Truman came up with what they call the Truman Doctrine, which was put in place about 1947. The Truman Doctrine was this U.S. policy to contain communism from spreading. So they're worried about it spreading all over the place. And so we did that by trying to give aid to various foreign countries in Europe, like Greece and also Turkey, to prevent the spread of communism. And a lot of people believe 1947 is about maybe when the whole Cold War started as a whole. The Marshall Plan followed after that. The Marshall Plan was called the European Recovery Program. It was a U.S. program between 1948 to 51 to aid Western Europe and to help get them back on their feet after World War II. And it was a program more or less that was there geared towards trying to prevent Western Europe from going communist. That's pretty much why it was there. And the guy that led it was George C. Marshall, who was the Secretary of State. And that's why it got named Marshall Plan. But its original name was actually called the Economic Recovery Program, or ERP for short. Then in 1948 to 49, Joseph Stalin, if you know about it, he blockaded Berlin, West Berlin, and the Soviets wanted to take control of West Berlin. What happened was they blockaded all the roads and the waterways, and so what happened was the Allies decided that the only way they were going to be able to get relief to West Berlin was to basically do an airlift. So that led to the Berlin Airlift, which went from I think June 1948 to about May 1949. And the West flew something like 200,000 sorties to help out West Berlin to keep them on their feet so that they don't fall to the Soviets, the communists, East Germany. And it eventually worked, and Stalin gave in. However, part of why the Soviets wanted to do this was because a lot of people in the East, like East Germany, whatever, were fleeing to the West through West Berlin. You'll see later, but millions actually leave East Germany because they don't want to be under communism. Because of that Berlin blockade, which was really the first big crisis of the Cold War, it led to the formation of the NATO alliance in April of 1949. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was basically a defensive alliance of Western states, like Western Europe, North America, the United States, Canada, etc. And basically, it was a defensive alliance against the Soviets and their, Eastern Bloc forces. So the NATO was like the Western Bloc, and then you had the communists in the East, which was the Eastern Bloc. And the two had fought. They would have been World War III, and the Soviets responded with what is called the Warsaw Pact in May of 1955. And the Warsaw Pact was a communist alliance of Eastern Bloc countries, which I told you included Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Albania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. So it had looks like 8 countries that was basically in it. And that's the so-called Eastern Bloc that they dubbed it. In America, also, they had the second Red Scare. I don't know if you know much about that, but the late 1940s and early 50s, there was kind of an obsession with communism. A lot of people thought there was communists in the country. Some people called it McCarthyism. And there was a famous senator named Joseph McCarthy, started kind of a witch hunt against communists in the country. And people were actually brought before Congress where they were basically grilled. And most people, if they were communists, you know what they would say? I plead the fifth. That's what they would say. And so And they had committees like the House of Un-American Activities Committee that formed called HUAC, and it also accused people of being communists. And a lot of people were blackballed, and couldn't find work afterwards. They do think that there were communists basically in the U.S. The most famous arrested, if you know about it, was Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Were arrested, I think, around 1951, and they were accused of spying for the Soviet Union and giving them secrets, such as like the atomic bomb secrets. And if you know about it, they were executed in 1953 as Soviet spies. So yeah, it was serious business, and yeah, people were kind of still obsessed with communism up to like the 1960s and 70s. Then, of course, the other thing, of course, that scared people as well was that in Asia, you start seeing countries going communist too. And what happened was in China, China got taken over by communists after they ran Chiang Kai-shek out after the Chinese Civil War ended in 1945 to 49. And Mao Zedong became the main leader of China, and he formed what is called the People's Republic of China, founded in 1949, which is still around today. And China will become a major threat to, spreading communism throughout Asia, and it'll spread to other countries like Korea, Vietnam, of course, and afterwards. And that was the other thing; it was kind of a threat too. If you know much about Asia, Asian communism, and all of that. They also had the Korean War, which broke out too in the 1950s, which is right here, Korea. And Korean War was a war that was fought between 1950 to 1953. And what happened with Korea was this area in Asia that had been taken over by the Japanese during World War II. Well, they already had it, I think, at that point, but basically, after Japan left, the Soviets came in and the United States came in. They formed two separate states. North Korea became a communist state backed by the Soviets, also later the Chinese. And then South Korea became basically backed by the United States. And the ruler that the communists put in, of course, in North Korea was a ruler you may have heard of named Kim Il-sung, which is right there. He's the grandfather of Kim Il-jung, which is the ruler now, and called the Kim family. And he would rule as a dictator. He was kind of vicious. And Kim Il-sung had the backing of the Soviet Union. And what the North Koreans wanted to do was they wanted to invade South Korea and form a Korean unified state, but as a communist state. And so in June of 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and that was the main cause of why the war broke out. And eventually what happened was the North Korean forces actually drove the South Korean forces all the way down to the bottom of South Korea to what they call Pusan, which is right here. You can see. It looked like they were going to, conquer the whole thing, South Korea at that point. And what happened was in 1950, the United Nations intervened. It's like really one of the first big things they did, United Nations. And they hired Douglas MacArthur, American general, to support forces to go into Korea and help out South Korea. And about 90% of the forces that were UN forces that went in there were American. And so anyway, the Korean War became like one of the first hot wars or proxy war in basically the Cold War. And eventually we invaded North Korea, if you know about it, at the end of 1950, and pushed the North Koreans all the way up into what is North Korea. But what happened was, about the Korean War, was China intervened at the end of like November, December 1950. They came into the war. And that kind of caused the war to kind of stalemate. And so neither side could really win the war by 1953. And so what happened was they kind of divided Korea north and south along a demilitarized zone, along what is called the 38th parallel. And Korea is still divided. They still kind of at war because neither side signed an agreement to really in the war treaty. Also, yeah, both sides, like the Soviets, U.S., also got new types of atomic bombs, which, of course, if you know about it, 1952-53, both sides developed a hydrogen bomb, which is also called a thermonuclear bomb. And it's a type of fusion type weapon, which was like 100 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So both sides experimented with these bombs. Like the United States, I think, first blew up the first hydrogen bomb in November of 1952 called Operation Ivy Mike, and most of them were done in the Pacific experiments, and I think the Soviets did experiments up in the Arctic area, and maybe, yeah, Arctic area, I believe, like blowing up hydrogen bombs. And so both now had hydrogen weapons, hydrogen bomb type weapons, and so now they believed, that basically nuclear war was just ahead. They already started the space race at that point between both sides, and so, now they could launch, ICBMs at each other, that kind of thing. Also in the 50s, 1953, Stalin died. If you know about this, he died, and what happened was afterwards, they had what they called de-Stalinization followed in the Soviet Union. That was a period of where they had a series of political reforms in the Soviet Union that started under Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev was the main ruler of the Soviet Union from like 56 to maybe 64. And they had what they call the Khrushchev thaw, where basically they started opening up the gulags, letting people go. They got rid of the policies of Stalin. Like there was that cult of personality you may have heard of about Stalin, which they got rid of. Repression, censorship was kind of relaxed. And so you kind of like some liberalization kind of going on in the Soviet Union as a whole. However, there were various crises that occurred between the Soviet Union and the West that didn't help the situation. They had the Suez Crisis and the Hungarian Revolution, both happened in 1956. The Suez Crisis was where the Republic of Egypt under Gamal Nasser seized the Suez Canal from Britain and France, which I think had controlled it for years. This angered Britain and France, and so they intervened with what is Israel, the state of Israel, which was to the east, and they invaded the Sinai Peninsula and tried to take the canal. And the Soviet Union intervened, and they threatened to declare war if they didn't, remove their forces. So it was kind of an embarrassment for the British and the French. And what happened was afterwards, the Soviets began backing a lot of the Middle Eastern countries like Egypt and Syria. And it's part of the things that's part of the Arab-Israeli wars, which was kind of an extension of the Cold War and all that, which I probably won't have time to do in this lecture. But then the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 occurred by November 1956, and that was where Hungarians, because of the de-Stalinization, tried to overthrow communism in their country. And it was believed to have been started October of 1956 by students in colleges and universities, like in Budapest. And eventually it got so bad, the revolution, that it toppled the Hungarian government. And eventually the Soviet army was actually pushed out of Hungary. And what happened was the Soviets decided they didn't want this to happen. So the Soviets went in there and they crushed it. And so the Hungarian Revolution, I think, lasted like maybe 2 weeks. And that was about it. The West couldn't do anything about it because it would have been World War III if we went in there. The other thing they had too was they had conflicts going on between the Soviet Union and the United States, which that was caused by different things. I'll give you a bunch of incidents that helped cause basically the tensions between the East and the West. In 1960, in May 1st, 1960, they had the U-2 incident. That was an incident where U.S. U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. We had been trying to spy on the Soviets, and what happened was the pilot of the plane, his name was Francis Gary Powers, was actually captured by the Soviets, and it became a big embarrassment. And so that didn't help, the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. Also, they had the crisis over Berlin. That was another big thing. Starting around 1960, under Khrushchev, he gave the West an ultimatum to get out of West Berlin, or they would take it. And so it led to the so-called Berlin Crisis of 1961. And the Berlin Crisis was where basically the Soviets they wanted West Berlin because everybody was leaving, like from East Germany was using West Berlin to get out. And between 1945 to 1960, 4.5 million people had left East Germany, which was about 25% of the population. And so that's why they built the Berlin Wall. It was something that was built between East Germany with the Soviets' help. And so starting in 1961, they built the Berlin Wall, which encircled West Germany. It was like a 96-mile wall that basically isolated West Berlin from the rest of East Germany, so nobody could try to get out. And the Berlin Wall, if you know about it, became the big symbol of the Cold War, especially in the West. And it stayed up from 1961 until it was torn down in 1989. The other big thing that was a conflict with the Soviets in the West was Fidel Castro. If you know about it, they had the Cuban Revolution, which was from 1953 to 59. And what happened was Fidel Castro, who turned out to be a communist Cuban, would seize power in Cuba in 1959. And he would ally with the Soviets. And so this became a big threat to the United States because you now got this communist state that's close to Florida. And so the United States tried to back his removal. So I think under John F. Kennedy in April of 1961, they tried the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was an anti-Castro Cuban plot to remove Castro. And they hired about 1,600 anti-Castro Cubans, which I guess lived in Florida or whatever, to try to basically take it back. And it was a total failure. And so Castro remained in Cuba until died in 2011, if you know about it. And now his brother still is in power too, Raul Castro. Of course, they had the Cuban Missile Crisis that was in October 1962, sometimes called the October Crisis. That was a 13-day confrontation that occurred between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it was all because what happened was when Castro was in power in Cuba, the Soviets allied with him and prevent the United States from possibly invading Cuba. The Soviets decided to deploy nuclear missiles, like ballistic missiles, to what is Cuba. And of course, the U.S. found out about it from U-2 spy planes flying over, and so that led to a crisis that lasted almost 2 weeks. And the U.S. threatened to invade Cuba if they didn't, if the Soviets didn't remove it. And so John F. Kennedy ended up blockading Cuba, if you know about it. That forced Khrushchev to eventually back down. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was really the peak Cold War event, of the whole thing, because they think that was the closest that the U.S. got to like a World War III with the Soviets. I could spend a few minutes on the Vietnam War a little bit. Now, the Vietnam War was a major hot war of the Cold War. It was fought about from 1955 to 1975. And it was a series of wars. They had the first war, which was the First Indochina War, which went from 1946 to 1954. That was where the French tried to continue their empire in Indochina. And they fought against this guy named Ho Chi Minh. He was a Vietnamese Marxist, communist. He became eventually the leader of what is North Vietnam later. And he had this communist Vietnamese organization called the Viet Minh, it was called. They fought the French in their army and eventually defeated them. You know about this in 1954 at a battle called Dien Bien Phu. And the French forces were surrounded in northern Vietnam. And it forced the French to withdraw from Vietnam. And so what happened afterwards was in 50, I guess it's 55, I think is the year. 55, they divided Vietnam in half. North Vietnam became basically divided from South Vietnam at the 17th parallel, which is right here. North Vietnam was communist, led by Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam was more of a democratic capitalist state, which was, of course, backed by the United States later. And so those two are kind of separate afterwards. Will stay separate for 20 years, 1955 to 1975. And how did the U.S. get involved directly? Well, the U.S. Was already given aid to Vietnam going back to like Eisenhower and all that, President Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower. And anyway, there was an incident that happened in August of 1964 called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. That was where some U.S. destroyers were attacked by, they think was North Vietnamese gunboats in the Gulf of Tonkin, called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And the U.S. decided to intervene directly, and so Lyndon B. Johnson, who was the President of the United States, got Congress to pass what is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And what that did was it was an authorization to allow the U.S. to intervene directly to aid South Vietnam against North Vietnam. And so U.S. went in there starting really in 1964-65, and we'll be in there for almost 10 years fighting. And I think at one point, by 1968, we had close to 500,000 American forces fighting in South Vietnam. Now, in South Vietnam, the U.S. would have to fight against two sides. We fought against the Vietcong. The Vietcong was basically communist guerrillas, Vietnamese communist guerrillas that basically backed North Vietnam. They were based pretty much throughout South Vietnam. They fought kind of a guerrilla campaign against the American forces. Then you also had the NVA, which is the North Vietnamese Army. They also fought them. And the North Vietnamese used what they call the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran through Laos and Cambodia. They used that to attack the South, which made it very difficult for the U.S. to win the war. And it got so bad that the U.S. even tried to invade Laos during the war, and also Cambodia, to go up into the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We also bombed North Vietnam during the war, bombed quite a lot, and that resulted in a lot of casualties. A lot of Vietnamese were killed in the war because of all the bombings that were done throughout the whole country. I think we dropped more bombs on Vietnam than they did in the World War II, supposedly. The peak of the war was, by the way, the Tet Offensive, you may have heard of, in 1968, and that was a surprise offensive by the North Vietnamese and also the Vietcong. They think it helped to turn the war in their favor, even though they lost it, because psychologically, strategically, Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam eventually won the war. And under Richard Nixon, who became president after LBJ stepped down, withdrew forces by 1973. So the Vietnam War was really a failure because eventually by 1975, North Vietnam would actually invade South Vietnam and would take Saigon in 1975. And so basically Vietnam became a united communist state, and it's still pretty much the same as it was then. Of course, Vietnam is now more aligned with us, and I think that's because of China, which I think Vietnam sees China as their real enemy now. Now, let's also talk about the later part of the Cold War. They also had détente. I'll briefly talk about what that was. Détente was this easing of strained relations between the United States and the Soviet Union that occurred starting in the 1970s. They believe it was started by Richard Nixon. Nixon started kind of trying to get countries like the Soviet Union and China to open up and form kind of more friendly terms. I think Nixon went to China 1972, and I think also he met with the ruler of also of Russia, which was Soviet Union, which was Brezhnev. Brezhnev, and from 1964 to about 1982, Leonid Brezhnev was the ruler of the Soviet Union. He was like the second longest reigning ruler of the Soviet Union behind Stalin. And it's under him that they try to, there's like different policies where both sides start signing, like, they had the SALT agreements you may have heard of, which was the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks that were done between the Soviets and the U.S. And that was important because it led to the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which came out in 1972. It was like an arms control treaty between the Soviets and the U.S. To kind of prevent maybe nuclear war from breaking out. And it limited the amount of like ICBMs they could have, like both sides, which I think was limited to only 200. Still a lot, So you had that happen. But things didn't go well. You know what happened? They had what they call the Brezhnev Doctrine, which Brezhnev kind of developed. And the Brezhnev Doctrine was this Soviet policy where if any country they thought was threatened, that was a threat to the Soviet Union, they would try to attack it. And apparently this happened in Czechoslovakia. There was the Prague Spring in 1968 where in Czechoslovakia they tried to create some kind of democratic reforms or whatever. And Brezhnev went in there with the Soviet forces and basically crushed it, as an example. And then also in 1979, if you know about it, the Soviets intervened in Afghanistan from 1979 to the 1980s. And that created a lot of tensions between, the Soviets and the U.S. And the U.S. actually backed guerrillas against the Soviets in Afghanistan, like the Mujahideen, if you know about that. So all this kind of went through like the 70s, and Brezhnev would eventually die in 82, and it would take a while, I think, until about 1985, where both sides began to kind of warm up more. But the detente was like kind of like I said, a slow thaw, between the East and the West at that point. Let me also talk about the end of the Cold War. Now, the end of the Cold War, usually the years of it is like over like a 5-6 year period from 1985 to about 1991. That's about when the Cold War would end. There's like a lot of different causes of why the Cold War ended. Of course, a lot of it had to do with the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed, about this by 1991. A lot of it had to do with the reforms by Mikhail Gorbachev, who I don't have a picture of, but Gorbachev was the last ruler of the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev started making reforms in the country. It's two big things he did that's famous. One was he promoted a lot of liberalization in the country, which they call glasnost, which meant openness. And then also he tried to restructure the economy to be more capitalist, the capitalist economy. And they call it perestroika, which was restructuring. And so that had a lot to do with why that occurred. And that meant that they were more open to democratic views and capitalism. And so that spread throughout Europe. And so Eastern Europe over time, what happened was they decided to revert back to having democracy and capitalism. And over time, they overthrew that, if you know that, in the 1980s. And so countries like Hungary, East Germany, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, all basically overthrew communism. They create democratic capitalist states as a whole. Also, the Berlin Wall falling in 1989 also contributed to the end of the Cold War. Pretty much, if you know about the Berlin Wall was torn down, and then what happened was Germany became unified as one state. They think that played a role in why the Cold War ended. And then in December 1991, if you know about, the Soviet Union collapsed. It ended. You know, it was gone. Lasted maybe about 70 years. And with the Soviet Union collapsing, that pretty much was the death knell of the Cold War. And that was the end of communism in Eastern Europe overall. They still have communism in other areas, like, you know, in mostly Asia and Cuba and all of that. But yeah, this post-war period that comes, post-Cold War period that comes afterwards, that follows, which is kind of also confusing too because of 9/11, what happens later. But that's pretty much the end of the Cold War. But the World War II and the Cold War had a major effect, you know, on pretty much the world as a whole. And we're still seeing it today, you know, overall. So that concludes this lecture on the end of World War II and the Cold War. And hey, we made it. We made it at the end of the semester. Yay!